Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us, depending on your time zone. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Associate Director at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. On behalf of my colleagues and co-organizers, I'd like to welcome you to our fifth of 7 panels on our series of Queer Focus. The series has generous sponsorship from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as from peer regional centers throughout the US. This series is now in its 4th year, having previously centered on themes such as race, intersectionality, and decolonization. So as you know, if you've been following along, our focus this year is on queer communities throughout Eastern Europe and Eurasia. I invite you, our audience, to join all the panels that are taking place this semester. I will pop a link into the chat in a few minutes to give you a chance to go and check out the 2 future sessions we still have upcoming. And you can also find all the previous sessions on the Davis Center YouTube channel. This year's series was developed and executed by Emma Pratt and Alicia Baca at Ohio State Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as Zuzana Magdo at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. We also have a large number of institutional sponsors who I'd like to thank, most of them peer regional studies centers across the US, including at the University of Kansas, the University of Michigan, the University of Texas at Austin, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University of Bloomington, the George Washington University, the University of California, Berkeley, and Arizona State University. And last but certainly not least, we extend our gratitude to all of the speakers who either have participated or will be participating in this year's series and are stepping into this conversation, which is so critical for our field. So today's focus is obviously on migration. And before I turn it over to our moderator, a bit of housekeeping. Please use the Zoom Q&A function to post any questions you have for our speakers. Questions that come in through YouTube will also be shared with our moderator, who for today's session is Dr. Alexandra Novitskaya. Dr. Novitskaya is a 2023-2024 Title VIII Research Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute at the Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University Bloomington. She has a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Stony Brook University, and her research interests include queer migration, making her a perfect addition to today's panel, and political asylum, LGBTQ human rights, and the geopolitics of homo and transphobia. Her research has been published in the Russian Review, Post-Soviet Affairs, Europe-Asia Studies, and NORMA, the International Journal for Masculinity Studies. So, Alexandra, thank you so much for shepherding today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I am honored to be on this panel, to be the moderator. And thank you so much to the organizers for bringing us all together today. We have an excellent lineup of the speakers who approach queer migrations from multiple angles, as you will see very shortly. Before I introduce them, I would like to say just a few words on why we have gathered here today, why migration is becoming one of the central themes in today's Slavic, East European, and Eurasian queer studies. So 3 things. First, to me, personally and professionally, themes of migration and queerness are intrinsically or even organically intertwined. To quote from Luc Baudouin, who had just presented in one of the previous installments of this series, from his new excellent book, Lost and Found Voices for Gay Male Writers in Exile, queers abandon the heterosexual culture of their biological families to create their own cultures and models in perpetual diaspora. That is to say, there's a similarity in the very experiences of migration and queerness, because both migrants and queer people undergo a process of self-reinvention. And while migration always assumes a physical journey from one country to another, and a symbolic journey of adaptation or adjustment to the new culture, just growing up as a queer person also already means a degree of separation or even alienation from the mainstream heterosexual culture from one's family and society at large. And also a symbolic journey to self-reinvention, right? To adaptation, to being queer and to thriving, hopefully. So in queer migrants' experiences, all these processes come together. And second, we are observing today growing international polarization over queer rights. Some countries institute LGBTQ-friendly policies, such as marriage equality or adoption laws, anti-discrimination protections, gender identity laws, etc. And other countries double down on institutionalizing homo and transphobic violence and discrimination, or sometimes just outright demonize queer people. It is a messy and uneven process, and sometimes backlash happens very closely, even coexists within the same country where some progressive change has also happened. And queer people respond to these processes by moving, by literally voting with their feet when they can, of course. Not every queer person can migrate. So global queer migration is on the rise today as never before, along with global migration in general. And in the countries of our interest here, that is Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe and Eurasia, these processes are explicit. Russia's war against Ukraine and its domestic promotion of homo and transphobia under the auspices of so-called traditional values are just two extreme cases that have been creating queer displacement and refugees and migration. And finally, where I am and our other panelists too located in Western academia, queer migration studies has been a dynamic and evolving field for close to 30 years now. And there's research on queer diasporic communities and cultures, legal aspects of queer migration, importantly, a serious and vital scholarship on queer refugees and asylum, and yet the voices of queer migrants from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, the region or regions, sometimes referred to as post-Soviet or post-communist, and both are problematic terms, or the New East, and I could continue with different names, but the point is that this is an extremely diverse region or regions that evade an easy categorization. So the voices of queer migrants from these regions have largely been absent from queer migration studies. Around 10 years ago, when I started my own research project on queer asylum seekers from the Soviet countries who were arriving in New York City in rapidly growing numbers, I was at the same time impressed by the huge body of literature within queer migration studies that had already existed, and by how little there was on actually queer migrations from these regions. As I acquainted myself with this literature, I also just kept on thinking how often it could not adequately explain the experiences of the people I was interviewing for my dissertation at the time, or the very conditions, what in migration research we call push and pull factors, or the very infrastructures of their migrations. I hope that today's speakers will mitigate these theoretical and empirical gaps by introducing their scholarship. So no pressure at all on you folks. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers, and we will go in the alphabetical order. So our first speaker is Dr. Maria Levitness, and I will introduce everyone at once. So our first speaker is Dr. Maria Levitness. Maria is a scholar, queer activist, and psychotherapist. She received her doctorate in psychotherapy from the University of Edinburgh in 2020. Her past research delved into the narratives of everyday life of queer people living in Kazakhstan. Maria's current research looks at the Russian queer migration to Central Asia following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Her previous and upcoming publications have focused on the role of Soviet discourses in the narratives of queer people in Kazakhstan, queer immigration and queer activism in Kazakhstan and Russia. Maria's work foregrounds lived experiences, examining how the socio-political context shapes everyday life in authoritarian regimes. Our second speaker is Dr. Randall Rowe, who is the Assistant Professor of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, annual adjunct in the Department of Asian, East European, and German Studies at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio. He defended his dissertation titled Mediated Social Hierarchies and Gender and Sexuality in the Russian Federation in the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at the Ohio State University. He earned a BA from Michigan State University and master's degrees from OSU and New York University. He published a chapter in the 2022 volume edited by Yana Hashamova, Juana Popescu-Sandu, and Sunny Rocker-Chang, Cultures of Mobility and Alterity, Crossing the Balkans and Beyond. Our third speaker is Dr. Marina Shevtsova, who is a senior postdoctoral fellow at KU Leuven. She holds a PhD in political science from Humboldt University, Berlin, and is a Fulbright and Swedish Institute alumna. Prior to studying her work at KU Leuven, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia, and her research interests include LGBTQ rights and activism in Central and Eastern Europe, queer migration, and anti-gender movements. Among her recent publications, there is a monograph, LGBTI Politics and Value Change in Ukraine and Turkey, Exporting Europe, published in 2021, and an edited volume with Rajana Buyantuyeva on LGBTQ plus activism in Central and Eastern Europe, published in 2020. She is also the editor of a new and a really important book, Feminist Perspectives on Russia's War in Ukraine, Here Are Voices, which has just been published with Lexington Books. Congratulations, by the way. And our fourth speaker is Yevgeny Shtorn, who is a writer, activist, and researcher originally from St. Petersburg. Due to his involvement in civil society work, he was forced to leave Russia in 2018. In 2019, he was granted international protection in the Republic of Ireland. He currently works as a social and cultural diversity consultant, collaborating with universities and cultural and civil society institutions. Shtorn's writing has been published in academic journals, anthologies, and new media outlets in Russia, Spain, Germany, and Ireland. As an activist, he has been involved in human rights and LGBT advocacy for almost 2 decades. He is a co-founder of Queer Diaspora Ireland, an initiative that supports LGBT people living in direct provision, which is the system for asylum seekers in Ireland. In 2022, Shtorn was recognized as the Person of the Year by the National LGBT Federation of Ireland. Well, so let's get started. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just going to share my screen. I hope everybody can see this. Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to be in such a fantastic on 2 pieces of work that I do in collaboration with my colleague, Polina Kislitsina, an independent researcher. So Polina will be sort of implicitly here with me today.
Maria, I believe your screen share stopped. You had a bit of a freeze, and now we don't see your screen share anymore.
Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, everything just jumped. Let me stop that. Lovely technology. So is this better? Is this working?
Perfect.
Thank you. Right. I was just saying that what I will focus today on. So one thing that I will be focusing on is the article that will come out around September this year that centers on the narratives of queer immigration of people who haven't left their home countries and live in Kazakhstan and Russia. This article is based on a 2017 narrative interview study that was conducted in Kazakhstan and a 2018 biographical interview study that was based in Russia and conducted by Polina. Moreover, I will be briefly touching upon some preliminary findings from our ongoing research on Russian queer migration to Central Asia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So let me just speak a little bit to this division between the West and East and North and South, which has been well documented and critiqued within queer studies. And such dichotomy indeed is deeply intertwined with the question of coloniality. And there are 2 dimensions to this debate. One is spatial, and from spatial perspective, it's important to ask, where are the boundaries and relations? What are the relations between those locales? Are they real? Are they imagined? Because the same place can be more west or east, depending on the vantage point. From the temporal perspective, there is a progressivist model of development that offers a dichotomy of East and South as a place of archaic gender and sexual order, as opposed to modernized, progressive, and liberal West. And Poir's concept of homonationalism connects with those dimensions, speaking to how those discourses are employed by nation states and global Northwest in service of national exceptionalism. And when considering queer narratives in Central Asia in particular, it is crucial to acknowledge Central Asian colonial past in relation to Russian Empire, Soviet Union, as well as Russian and global coloniality persistent in the region to date. And the history of Russian migration to Central Asia is again deeply interconnected with the settler colonialism and colonialism in the region. There is no statistics on queer immigration in Central Asia, from Central Asia or Russia. However, it is important to note that in the article that we co-wrote with Paulina, neither of our studies initially focused on immigration. Both of our studies focused indeed on aspects of everyday life. The topic of immigration was organically brought up, and both of us were pretty surprised with how often it came up in our interviews. And the topic of migration is very alive in regions. In Kazakhstan, according to National Bureau of Statistics of Republic of Kazakhstan, the number of immigrants in Kazakhstan is growing every year. And it's a crucial question from Kazakhstani officials' perspective in terms of this people with higher education and specialized education are leaving the country. In Russia, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, again, the question was quite strongly put as in terms of number of immigrants being very high. Levada Center found that every fifth Russian wanted to go abroad, and that's from 2021 study. The full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine has instigated a further surge of immigration from Russia. And with a crackdown on LGBTQIA plus people following the invasion, with the expansion of gay propaganda law and the bill targeting gender affirmative healthcare and the international LGBT public movement being announced as extremist, all of that has further instigated queer migration. Whereas the West, however, was previously perceived as one of the priority destinations for Russian immigrants and particularly for queer people, with the airspace for most Western countries close to Russian plains, Central Asian countries and South Caucasus are now considered possible safe spaces. The picture on the slide is a poster for the movie that is called Welcome to the USA, directed by Asel Aushakimova, that addresses the theme of queer migration from Kazakhstan, telling the story of Aliyah, who won the green card lottery and cannot decide whether to leave Kazakhstan or stay. And the question of whether to leave or stay is an interesting one, and it links to the concept that we're using in our article, the concept of inner immigration. There are different traditions of dealing with this concept. From Soviet context, we draw on the work of Alexei Yurchak, who writes that inner or internal immigration is the metaphor that describes this extreme example of Soviet people managing to lead a creative and imaginative life despite the pressures and repressions from Soviet authorities. Yurchak suggests another term, вненаходимость, вне being outside, as a broader concept that includes both inner immigration and less extreme examples of existence outside of the authoritarian discourse, when people are involved in any activity of the Soviet system but ignore most of the regime in play. Outside of the Soviet Union, the term inner immigration has been used to refer to writers, poets, intellectuals who remained in Nazi Germany while distancing themselves from the totalitarian regime. So the term itself raised significant contradictions around the distinction between complicity and resistance. In our work, we apply this term to encapsulate inner or psychological dissent of individuals from their country of origin who are not willing or able to leave their country. And our conceptualization is linked with Yurchak's ненаходимость, as it emphasizes this duality, neither being in nor out, this position that is pretty ambiguous. So now I just wanted to share some snippets from our data, some quotes. The thoughts and fantasies about immigration are constant. So for example, I think about immigration all the time, cisgender lesbian from Moscow says. And we think of those fantasies as a way to tolerate living on the limits of norms. In Kazakhstan, where there is no propaganda law, immigration is seen as plan B in case political and social change happen that might affect the precarious position of queer citizens. And Europe and generally the West are considered as ideal immigration destinations for many of the participants. The West indeed appeared as a progressive, civilized, while their homelands are often depicted as lagging behind. In the quote on the slide, I understand that our country is 100 years behind. The civilized European Union is illustrating that. And the West, within narratives of our participants, is usually depicted as a very homogeneous space. It's a bit ambiguous what is even meant by that. It's universally queer-friendly. interestingly, not only queer people themselves refer to the West. There is another narrative that comes up about being sent to Europe. So, for example, the quote from cisgender homosexual man from Astana, who spoke to me about his experience at university and being bullied when his course mates thought that him and his friends are together. And they said, it's better for us to move to Europe or something. So they were actively sent to Europe. That was observed. So Europe is depicted as a place where queerness belongs to, again, mimicking some of the homo-nationalist narrative and discourse. Participants emphasize that while they often think about immigration, there are many factors, including family practical issues such as language and financial constraints, that limit their choices to live or remain. Indeed, many participants in our studies expressed ambivalent position towards immigration. On the one hand, they talked about some of the difficulties that queer people face in Kazakhstan and Russia. And on the other hand, they were firm about not wanting to leave their country of origin. And the quote on the slide is really depicting them. The quote is from a bisexual woman from Astana. And she speaks that even though sometimes she's quite sick of this society, but then she says, on the other hand, I know that I love my country, even though it does not love me back. My family is here and I'm close to them. Even if I do go, I think I would return. And that sort of challenges some of those common trajectories in narratives depicting Europe as an ideal space. And actually, she's saying even in Canada, or the West is an ideal space, even in Canada or somewhere else, those things will still be here. And in this article, as I said before, we use the inner migration as a form of defense to tolerate the often intolerable and precarious realities that queer people face in Russia and Kazakhstan. Living in anticipation of immigration has various effects. And the narrative of Gulzada, who chose to opt out of anonymization, shows that. Gulzada speaks to some community of lesbian women she was introduced to in Almaty. And she speaks to this sentiment. They just wanted to get rich, earn money quickly, and get out, свалить куда-то. My life, on the other hand, was here and not somewhere else. Only later did I meet people who actually wanted to be here. They would not look out there, oh, Spain or something, somewhere out there where everything is set up for them. And just very briefly to touch upon some of our findings that we're finding just now, it is quite important, as our current research was born out of this article while we were writing. The Russian full-scale invasion happened, and of course the surge of queer migration. For many Russian people, full-scale invasion, or many Russian queer people who we interviewed, full-scale invasion of Ukraine became the last drop to immigrate. And Central Asia was often a pragmatic choice because of ease of crossing border, not needing a foreign passport to go to Central Asia, not needing to learn another language, or having a job or friends or family there. Some return to the place where they were born after living for many years in Russia. Progressivist narrative is often reproduced, and participants juxtapose again this dichotomy of Central Asian countries are compared to Russia or the West, with Central Asian countries being depicted as lagging behind Europe. At the same time, participants speak of Central Asia relating to Russia of the past, when Russian regime was experienced as less repressive or freer. And there are some contradictions. On the one hand, participants in our study speak about the relative freedom of queer people in countries such as Kazakhstan compared to Russia. On the other hand, remarks on the traditional values that Central Asian countries have, and the references to Muslim stereotypes that Muslims are conservative, homophobic, and transphobic. So referring to Central Asian hospitality and expressing disappointment if Central Asian did not live up to their hospitable identity, that sort of traces some of the Orientalist narrative as well as homo-nationalist discourse. And majority of participants view their stay in Central Asian countries as temporary and intend to relocate to the West in the undefined future. At the same time, we also see in our findings ways in which some Russian queer migrants are reflexive about their privilege and Russian imperialism. Some engage in actively challenging their relatives and friends, racism that they hear, as I learned Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, and do their best to integrate and contribute towards local queer communities. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any further questions, feel free to ask during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. So our next speaker is Dr. Randall Rowe. Randy, take it away.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and thank you, Chris and Emma, for the support. I will be presenting today on a documentary film by HBO called Welcome to Chechnya, which fits in quite nicely, actually, with Welcome to the US, the film previously spoken about by Maria. I'm particularly concerned with invisibility and anonymity in the film, which is to say how the filmmakers protected the identity of the subjects of the film, but also how we can consider visibility and invisibility in terms of neoliberalism and human rights and activism in the Russian Federation. This film does rely on novel technology that they call face doubling. This is essentially deep fake technology, which is a charged term, so the director prefers face doubling. So the film centers around the efforts of activists, both local and international. Here you have the subject of the film, Maxim Lapunov. He is known as Grisha throughout most of the film, and then here we have Olga Baranova and David Istiev. So Olga here is the director of the Moscow Community Center for LGBT Resources, and David is the director of the crisis group for the North Caucasus. Here is Igor Kachitkov. He is the director of the Russian LGBTQ network and becomes a very public advocate and kind of part of this team for Maxim, who eventually brings charges in Russian court against the Chechen government for the so-called gay purges that are happening there and his personal experience of being held captive for 12 days. And so the film here very clearly is aware of their questions of visibility and the depiction of how they anonymize their subjects, but the depiction of visibility in the film. Here you have the hands covering the face, which is reminiscent, of course, of the first film, the first screenshot here. This is actually Maxim with his face double, and that's Maxim's partner covering his eyes. They do note in the film that Maxim's partner is concealing his identity here, but it also kind of is reminiscent of, you know, dealing with the grief and the horror of reality, right? Kind of thinking, oh gosh, you know, like again and again having to deal with this marginalization. Whereas you look into Maxim or Grisha's eyes here, and there's a look of exhaustion, but also of relief. They are on a plane actually to their place of refuge in Europe, as it's said by the film. And so again, the hands here with the face double, as it's known by the director, portrayed on them of Grisha. So at a certain point, and a pivotal point in the film, when they're actually giving a press conference, and the press conference is to announce the charges that Maxim will bring against the Russian government. His face slowly turns from the face double, which was made from a variety of activists' likenesses that were collected and kind of mixed together, if you will, in a by this novel technology, and then cast onto Maxim's face here. Maxim has blue eyes, and there are, of course, kind of brown, less detailed eyes here with brown hair, and this sandy blonde here of Maxim's actual identity. So being that this film is keenly aware of identity and phenotypical representation of its subjects, it's quite interesting to view it through that lens. And so I here am thinking of West and East in terms of Stuart Hall's conception of the West, which is a unity based on neoliberal identity politics, visibility, human rights, that sort of thing, rather than any sort of geopolitical arrangement. And here in the film, there is an articulation of a hierarchy of East-West, which is placing Western Europe, of course, on top of the hierarchy in terms of acceptance of queerness and adherence to human rights, with Russia somewhere in the middle and Chechnya on the bottom, of course. So it's almost as if homophobia is also on this hierarchy. And so as the film follows the process of extracting these individuals from Chechnya, most of them first land in Moscow and then make their way to either Canada or the United States with the help of the Canadian US nonprofit Rainbow Railroad. Of course, Rainbow Railroad is a reference to the Underground Railroad, which has its history in the US slavery. So what's interesting here is that we have the West, not necessarily, I mean, going back to comments on homonationalism, the West being on top of this hierarchy, regardless of the reality of human rights in those countries. But then, interestingly enough, Moscow being kind of in the middle or higher up on the hierarchy. Now, this is for logistical reasons for the most part, right? It's easier to get people out of Russia via Moscow than it is Chechnya. In fact, there is a story of one woman who is hiding in somewhere in Central Asia, as the film says. And this woman is hiding for months and months and months until they can get her out of the country. Her father happens to be a high-ranking Chechen official. And she ends up leaving hiding and returning to Chechnya because it just simply is too much to live in hiding, to not be visible in society in a place that, is not necessarily your culture and everything. So she chooses the oppression and goes back home. Presumably, we don't actually know what happens of her. But going back to the director and the director of technology's awareness of this race and racialization. The director is quoted in a magazine interview and saying there's something magical about how Grisha's brown eyes turn from dark brown to light crystal blue, right? He often then mentions how they changed the shape of his face here because his true shape of face would reveal his true identity in some way. So as if there's a kind of Slavic Russian shape of skull as opposed to this ambiguously ethnic depiction, which I would argue is closer to more typical phenotype of okay. So David France, David France, the director here, is an American director, seemingly unaware of the potential problematic racialized depiction of Grisha, the anonymous identity, as opposed to Maxim. In every interview, the director is very aware of, again, the charged term deepfake, which has its roots in a non-consensual use of someone's identity. Therefore, he prefers the term face doubling because he is arguing for the protection, of course, of these people. And to be sure, this does achieve the protection of these people's identities, which is obviously important given the dangerous situation. But there is an obvious lack of understanding of how the racialized depiction might obscure different aspects of this experience. And this is where I guess my analysis comes in. And I feel a little bad here because the film is really, really hard to watch, of course, but it's a good film in bringing awareness to the situation and centering the experience of the activists and the migrants themselves. And so, you know, I don't believe that there's any nefarious intent here. However, there is you know, a lack of attention to the fact that Maxim, as a typically Slavic, blonde hair, blue-eyed, in the director's words, person, does have the I guess, comfort and support for bringing charges in a Russian court as opposed to a ethnically Chechen person. Now, this isn't to say that it is easy to bring charges or that Maxim wasn't extremely courageous in doing so. However, Maxim's situation is a bit different from those who are Chechen, none of which the ethnically Chechen individuals, none of their identities were revealed, none of their names were revealed. So Maxim is the only one in the film to have the face doubling effect. However, all others are shot with various degrees or various techniques. So either from above, from behind, etc. But they never use face blurring techniques, which we are typically used to. So, so while the film does achieve, you know, its goal of bringing awareness to the issue, there was widespread support among the West in film festivals and other awards. Many magazine, journal, and newspaper interviews and reviews were written about the film. None of these really grapple with the racialization of the face doubling technology. Several of them do ask questions about ethical questions about you know, re-victimizing people and the importance of hiding or anonymizing people's identities, but none of them seem to focus on the particular issues of racialization in terms of Slavic Russians versus Chechen Russian nationals. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy. Our next speaker is Marina Shevtsova. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexander, for a kind introduction and for bringing us all together. And we're such a diverse group, I think, in terms of the methodology and topics within this broader theme of queer migration. And makes sense, of course, for all the organizers and all participants for joining us today. I will be talking, so my presentation will be slightly or not slightly different from two previous ones. I won't be using the PPT, so I'll try to keep your attention with my voice. Let's see if it works. I wanted to talk about my research that goes for already how many, 5-6 years on queer migration from Ukraine, and particularly on its second, more recent part in the context of the Russian full-scale invasion. I was doing research on queer migrants from Ukraine, or queer refugees from Ukraine, to be precise, or those who were to ask for asylum and refugee in other countries in global north. From 2018 to 2021, doing field work in the US and also in Western European countries and Nordic countries. And what I faced, what I had to deal with was that I couldn't find the participants for my research who would not be cisgender gay men. So, and of course, this is not to say by no means that there were no such people, but this was just the thing that I had to deal with. So contacting organizations, asking people, using snowballing technique. It wasn't my main research focus at the time, neither it is now. So I have to say that, of course, I didn't dig deep enough. But it is also showing certain trends. So if you look at the typical or average refugee, queer refugee from Ukraine, at that point, you could say that these were relatively young men, cisgender gay men, who were going west in hopes to find a better life, seeing it as a in a way better place to be themselves, but also for career development, economic opportunities. So you have all this combination of different reasons to leave. It was almost never just the sexual orientation. And another thing is that I would say, looking at the those who tried to ask for asylum, I saw more people who, so to say, had nothing to lose in Ukraine. Of course, there were also some people who had their career and lives built, but more of them, but they would rather try then to find other ways to migrate, so through studies or through professional opportunities. But those who really decided to go and ask for asylum, they were heading towards global north, mostly also because Ukraine was really a tough place for them also economically. And then, of course, their stories were quite dramatic because what they inevitably discovered was that West is nothing like a paradise. But I wanted to focus more today on the second wave of my interviews and the second group that I interviewed in the last 2 years, which are the queer Ukrainians who left Ukraine, were forced to leave Ukraine in the last 2 years due to the large-scale invasion of that started in February 2022. And this is, of course, is a very, very different group. First of all, because men that are in the age from 18 to 60 were banned from leaving Ukraine. Still some managed. So I still had some cisgender gay men in my sampling, but mostly those were women or people with documents with female gender market, or trans people who had the documents with the diagnosis F64, which is gender identity disorder, and which in principle makes a person exempt from military service in Ukraine and allows to cross the border. It doesn't mean necessarily, by the way, that a person will be allowed to cross the border, especially if this person comes alone without being accompanied by a lawyer that is familiar with the procedure, or at least some activist who already crossed the border several times. But in theory, formally, those people are allowed to leave the country. What is a very big difference between these two groups? So majority of my interviewees, and I conducted more than 45 interviews in 15 Western European countries, is that 90% of those people, I would say, mentioned that they never wanted to leave Ukraine forever. They never thought of migration, and that they more or less were satisfied with their life in Ukraine. Many of them, at least a half, were also expressing the desire to come back to Ukraine when the situation allows. Secondly, these are the people who migrated not as queer people, but as Ukrainians. You know that the EU, and I'm talking only the migration to the EU member states. So there are no people. I didn't cover the US in this group. EU said Ukrainians are welcome, basically. So any person with Ukrainian passport could cross the border and then decide and choose, again, theoretically, whatever country to stay in. And finally, and of course, again, here, maybe a small side note, not all the people live in Ukraine because of the large-scale invasion were holders of Ukrainian passports. So there were also some people with Russian passports. Unfortunately, Ukraine is notoriously famous for not being easy to give Ukrainian citizenship to people there. So we had some people who had Russian partners, or Georgian partners who would ask to be granted citizenship, but they failed to receive it for many years because of the complicated procedure and certain discrimination. Also, this is something that needs to be talked about too. So for those people, of course, there were new challenges because the refugee welcome was only automatically applied to those coming from Ukraine with Ukrainian passports, and the situation is very different for those who came with the passports of other former Soviet republics. And now to illustrate, maybe because we have too short of a time to talk about all the complexities of this group, to illustrate why it is important to look at this group, and how looking at this group, queer migrants from Ukraine in the EU now, helps us to better understand EU migration policies, and also to better understand how intersectionality enters into the place, and why actually we need to look at this group. Because I was just today asked by one of the policy officers in Brussels, why do we have to look at the queer migrants in particular? I usually tell these two stories. These are two stories of my interviewees, and one of them is actually a story of my dentist. And I like this story, but it also makes me saddened. And I usually tell this story after the very common now in Belgium. I'm in Belgium now, that I hear that all those migrants, refugees, immigrants, they're coming, and they consume a lot of social wealth, of social support. They're using all this money without working, so they abuse the system. And I hear that a lot. You can imagine it's not very pleasant being a migrant yourself. So I always say, okay, look, I will tell you about my dentist. And my dentist is amazing. She worked in Kiev, and I would always, I've been living abroad for 12 years. I would always go to Kiev to have my teeth treated by her. She was like very good. Of course, it was also cheaper, but it's not the main reason why I went there. So she's also a lesbian. So she's a lesbian. They have a kid with her partner. And so when the war started, since many queer people felt under risk, but especially families with kids felt that they had to protect their kids, so they headed abroad almost immediately. And first they came to Poland because Poland is very good with, we have these connections with Polish LGBTQ rights organizations. So they came to Warsaw, and actually in Warsaw and in Poland, Ukrainian doctors are allowed to work. So it is very easy to get all the documentation, and she could start working in the clinic right away. However, you know that in Poland you cannot be, the relationship between two women wouldn't be recognized. The parental rights for the child that is a biological child of one of them wouldn't be recognized. And so they decided, okay, we go to Germany. So now my dentist, she's been living for 2 years in Germany, and she cannot work because clearly, apparently in Germany, you're not competent enough to treat people's teeth if you don't speak fluent German and if you don't pass the exam. And I think it is absurd because especially since she lives in Berlin, there are a lot of Russian-speaking people who would, fill up her schedule and be a very grateful clientele for her, but she's not allowed to do that. So she's basically learning German, which is a difficult language to learn, especially if you're an adult in a very stressed condition. And yes, for 2 years, she's consuming social welfare money. That's true. But she decided with her partner to go to Germany because it was important for them to be seen as a family, to be seen as a unit, and to be treated correspondingly. Now, you would say, or somebody would say, okay, but yeah, this is all very sad, but at least all those people go to these Western countries and they're recognized there as partners, and they can be visible. But the thing is, it's not obvious choice for everyone, or it's not the only choice for everyone to do so and say, okay, I want to be openly lesbian, I go there. So I have another story, and then we'll be wrapping up. And this is a story of another lesbian couple. This is just a coincidence, who live in Bratislava. And they're both highly qualified individuals. They had very nice work back home. They had quite a well of life, but they also have a child. So they arrived to Slovakia, and it was much easier for their child to be integrated in Slovakian school system. He already had some friends there. So they decided that they will stay in Slovakia, not to traumatize him, but also they have elderly relatives back home. So for them, it's very important to be close to border with Ukraine, to be able to go if something happens, immediately to help their grandparents. But in Slovakia, they can only work at the factory. And this is the vicious circle because they work at the factory 8 hours a day and they're super tired coming home. So there is no chance that they will be learning language to be further integrated and to, have this professional fulfillment. So I think for me, these two stories, and there are many more to tell, they show how the EU system and this vision of, refugees welcome is very distorted and is it's illusion. It doesn't exist. And the problem is not that, and I think in both cases, these are not some super complicated situations where no policy decision would have easily helped. I think there are many policy decisions that could be designed smartly, also to prevent, migrants to consume social welfare money. However, we know that it is much easier to throw populist slogans and to say that refugees are coming here to take our jobs and to, take our money rather than actually do something about this. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Marina. That was so important. Well, as everyone else's presentation. All right. So now let's hear from Evgeny Shtorn. Zhenya, please.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, all the panelists. I think, I'm very bad in speaking academic language, and I really want to call things the way I think they have to be called. But in any case, when Marina was speaking about Ukrainian people from Ukraine, it's also an ongoing debate in Ireland, which is an interesting on so many layers, because from one side we can see that there is this understanding that people from Ukraine, even though they were allowed to enter freely the EU, they still face a lot of challenges. And one of the biggest challenge in Ireland right now is the housing crisis. But at the same time, people who were living in direct provision is the system to accommodate people in need of international protection, spend their years and years and years, and are now not giving any accommodation. They are sleeping raw under the heavy Irish rains in the tents, and clearly having less support from the state than people from Ukraine, which makes them angry towards. So we have kind of a very complex situation of those who have been deprived blaming each other in a way, and not looking up, where actual governments are not doing their job well from my point of view. And in this case, I probably, even though we are speaking here about Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and I probably will touch on that a little bit, the things that I want to concentrate on are experiences of people seeking international protection. Let's say I will use Irish example, but I know that they are not exclusive, and I know that it has been, or similar anecdotal stories or illustrations that I will bring happened in Canada, in the US, in some other EU countries, and in the UK. And one of the stories that I always bring is a problem with the interviews. So the interview is something that the person going through the refugee procedure has to face. She or they have to speak with the officer to explain the case, and then the officer made recommendation to the Ministry of Justice, or depends on the country, on the authority to grant or refuse the actual refugee status. And when it comes to LGBT experiences, the officers very often show their limitations in understanding the LGBT experiences, because they may ask, do you like Madonna? And if the person answers, I don't know who Madonna is, or I don't really like, or whatever, like, it may be, and it has been interpreted as a sign of a clear lie. So the person cannot be LGBT because they don't like Madonna. Or do you follow Eurovision, or so things like that could be like an examples of how the LGBT in the global north that Maria touched in her presentation is seen. So there is a certain way of understanding that being an LGBT means a certain tastes, means a certain way of life, and certain interests, and so on and so forth. And another big issue with the LGBT community, when it especially comes to a smaller minoritarian languages, and I think that now Ukrainians are exempt from this needs of claiming for protection, but other languages, let's say like Georgian or Armenian or Central Asian languages, if people are coming from those countries to, let's say, a small European country, I know that Ireland is a very small country, and but Europe in general is consisting from smaller countries. The situation is that the translator from these minoritarian languages would be maybe one or two in the whole country. For people who are facing this challenge of speaking about their experiences back home that brought them outside, very often is almost impossible when it comes to someone who is, like in a way, an acts of union for for the whole diaspora very often. So it really becomes a big burden. And another thing for the, like an emotional burden to speak about it, but another thing is that it was a situation, and I won't specify further, but it was a situation when the translator said, "You're ashamed of my country," said in the language to the person who was telling the story, which completely, became like blocked them, and they didn't know how to react. And also only on the judicial review it was kind of addressed, and then they reconsidered. But at the very first time, because of that reaction, the recommendation was negative for the protection. So it somehow reflects the challenges that LGBT people are facing. And then another thing in the international protection process, I don't know how it is organized in the US, but in a lot of European countries, people are given a sort of state-supported accommodation, hostels or camps where they live sharing their space, rooms and toilets and kitchens and everything. And for LGBT people, very often it is a tremendously challenging experience, because they might be suddenly again exposed to a certain bullying, or again we are speaking about queer diaspora, but a part of the queer diaspora, there is a real diaspora, and the real diaspora might be pretty homophobic. And being pretty homophobic, this diaspora contained in the refugee camp is becoming a nightmare. It's becoming like, and suddenly incremented by 146 pressure to a person, to an individual in these facilities. So people are very afraid of leaving their homes. They're very afraid of leaving their rooms very often. They don't know where to go. And if they aren't in the bigger places like capital cities or bigger towns, very often they aren't. They are in very small villages where even the local LGBTs are, invisible, because they're afraid, or they feel intimidated, or they don't feel comfortable. In a rural Ireland, we will absolutely face the situation. I saw a project of, the kind of, if you open the grinder in a rural Ireland, all the profiles will be without face pics, because people don't want to show their faces. Now imagine you are in this kind of contained facilities, and now it's also exacerbated by the diaspora and by the far right, who is in the last few weeks it was several pretty violent things happening in Ireland towards the people claiming protection, because the police basically had been creating corridors to pass the newcomers from the bus to the hostel, because of the concentration of far right people shouting at them and saying them you have to leave and things like that. So there is a lot of kind of layers to this level of alienation that people are facing on the kind of formal, on the informal, and on the absolutely untouchable level, which is the relationship between the, with the diaspora in these languages that I don't understand and things. I touched on that a little bit in the book I published, but as Alexandra said at the very beginning, we have very limited amount of testimonies about for the experiences of people living in or experienced, those who experienced life in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, especially as LGBT. But then even those scars, texts wouldn't really have any platform because you cannot really publish it in Russian. You cannot really translate it easily because there are no ongoing programs of support or anything like that. And basically, it just remains invisible, or you have to switch into English or start writing in English and things like that. So there is a very little opportunities right now because Russian language had been basically occupied by the FSB officers, and we have been deprived from our language as well, and we cannot really use as LGBT people. I mean, we cannot really use it freely unless it's an internet and so on. But then, you cannot really publish, you cannot really have programs of support of elaborating or reflecting in Russian on your experiences, never mind like other languages which have even maybe less opportunities for that, because prior to that there were less editorials, there were less facilities to help people writing about their experiences in Kazakh or in Uzbek or in Georgian. And yes, I think that to somehow wrapping up the bringing the main point is that LGBT people in need of international protection very often are somehow forced to remain on the margin of the hosting society as well. And even though they sometimes may see Europe or global north as a place where they go and they find happiness, very often it won't be the case. Very often it would take years and years and years of struggling, of integrating, of reintegrating, of finding your communities, and maybe not even being able to do that ever, and maintain themselves on the margin of the society. And then yes, so this is something that I wanted to somehow highlight, but maybe I will elaborate more in the answers of the questions that Alexandra has prepared or other in the audience have. But another thing that I wanted to just highlight is that what Maria was saying about Kazakhstan and about the Central Asian, as someone who grew up in the 90s in the south of Kazakhstan, I have to say that the whole population, the whole kind of the change, the demographic change was so big, was so unprecedented, maybe on so many levels, that I really going there in 2010 when I was the last time, which is 14 years ago already. So my perception is pretty outdated, but still, I really was feeling like I was in absolutely different country. The country in the city where I didn't recognize, it's not just because everything was renamed, but even like everything changed, it was to an extent that it really, the country maybe somehow, like for a lot of people coming now from Russia, they really maybe were expecting to find something that isn't there anymore, and maybe it is also partly kind of reflected, or I would like you to kind of think about it while doing your research, because I think it's really important to observe this shift that the countries from the post-Soviet, let's say, space went through after the fall, after the 1991, because it really, and especially Kazakhstan, I think, because it was a country of a massive immigration during the Soviet period due to industrialization, Gulag, and other reasons. And then in the 90s, most of them would be leaving. So it is really an interesting. So you are conducting your interviews in Russian, I presume, right? But there is a lot of, I think it's very interesting, and I don't really have any understanding or any idea, even though I lived there for 17 years, is what actually people from AULs or LGBT people from Kazakh ethnic group experience. I have no idea, to be honest, being from there, so it is something that also reflect how being in the same place, we very often, our paths never cross. And with LGBT in Europe, very often it will be the same. They are here, or we are here, but we are in our kind of, small bubbles. We aren't connected to this hosting and free society that we imagine while running for our lives very often to this safe havens. So yeah, this is me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evgeny. Well, thank you, everyone. So we have about 20 minutes left for the Q&A. I have some questions from the audience. I think I'll start with those. And then, if we have time left, I'll ask a few questions of my own that I've prepared. So the first question, I believe, is from Marina. Can you elaborate on military service, Ukraine, and LGBTQ folks?
Should I answer right away?
Yeah, let's just do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm not sure in which direction the person who asked would like me to go, but I will say briefly that of course there is this momentum for Ukrainian LGBTQ people, with many people in the military who started coming out publicly in the recent 2 years. So clearly LGBTQ people have been there always, but we only had a handful of openly LGBTQ veterans and soldiers who were active and who were showing their face. So it changed with the full-scale invasion because basically of the fact that people understood that now when they have nothing to lose, instead, it is important that, for example, their partners would gain the pension of a soldier if they die in the battle, or all the other socioeconomic rights, and also recognition in the society while you are risking your life in the front line. Now, another thing that and it led, as you know, to the petition for legalization of same-sex partnerships, civil unions, but this is still pending. So the Verkhovna Rada, Ukrainian parliament, is still going through it, the respective committees. At the same time, maybe one thing to mention is that there was or there has been some tension between queer and feminist, especially leftist groups from the global north and Ukraine in regard with growing militarization of the society, and there were calls not to stop sending weapons to Ukraine and so on. So in this, I would say at least the mainstream LGBTQ community, including obviously those who are in the military, feel that this is they don't these appeals and calls definitely don't resonate with them. So it feels very patronizing and kind of West-plaining, telling the people, being in the country under attack. And especially for those, for example, who are in occupied areas, when we hear about murders towards LGBTQ people in Kherson and Mariupol, I would say there's a big hypocrisy to say don't send weapons to Ukraine, and telling Ukrainian queer people or feminists to be pacifists. And there are already, so in the book, so a second of self-promotion in the book that just came out, this feminist perspective on Russia's war in Ukraine, there is a chapter with many interviews with queer soldiers written by Daphne Rachok and Ivan Shmatko. So please ask your university to buy the book and read it.
Thank you so much, Marina. The next question from the audience is from Inés Sanchez de Guillermo, and it's for Maria. Could you expand on the concept of neo-Nakhodimist, please? I have a few questions in relation to it. So how can people through neo-Nakhodimist be in and out of the system at the same time? How is this opposed to escapism? And are there certain narratives or patterns that can be found across participants, or are there very diverse processes of creating one's own reality parallel to those of authoritarian regimes?
Thank you for the question. I mean, those are two quite big questions, so I'll try to be quite short. But the question on the concept of inner immigration and Nina Khadimist in particular speaks to the critique and some of the critique of this concept, and particularly Hannah Arendt, who spoke of this phenomena quite critically. She was speaking about this contemplative detachment as part of detaching also from the realities of totalitarianism. So what happens and what concerned Arendt wasn't necessarily the act of retreat or escapism itself. That's for Arendt was quite natural. But the way in which migrants or inner migrants sort of detach themselves from the world. Arendt warns that in the face of adversity or unbearable reality, the temptation is to ignore the world in favor of idealized version of it or some future that might happen. So there is this aspect of how this is distinguished from escapism, I suppose. So Arendt very much warns against that. The way we are using the concept in our paper is to think how people make sense of living in the country whilst also planning to move, or in a constant anticipation of moving. And many of participants in our study very much occupy that position. Because, for example, one participant spoke about we can't have children in Russia as a queer couple, then they felt it would have been too dangerous and precarious for them. So it was always in some future when we will move, but it's uncertain because of the financial restraints, because of various other practical restraints. In terms of narratives and themes, and I've highlighted some of them, but other things that participants brought up was this constant anticipation of immigration in the future that I just spoke to, the construction of West as an ideal space, which was quite a shaky narrative as well. It was a very interesting, the very construction of space, of the idea of the West. For example, Russia was not treated as the West by Kazakhstani participants, and who saw, even though portions of Russia are located northwest of Kazakhstan, and prior to full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kazakhstan was one of the top, Russia was one of the top destinations for immigrants from Kazakhstan. I think 72% of immigrants from Kazakhstan went to Russia, but it did not mirror, at least in results of my study. And the case against immigration, I love my country, but it doesn't love me back, that sort of strong sentiment that some people don't want to or didn't want to leave neither Kazakhstan or Russia, and inner immigration was another theme. So I hope that summarizes it.
Thank you so much, Maria. So I have a few questions too, as I said, for everyone. So, well, who feels like answering. So, my first question is, what do you think is your most important contribution of your research on queer migrations to queer studies in the region? And what do you hope that the audiences who joined us today and those who will read your work tomorrow, or maybe watch the recorded webinar, figuratively speaking, will take away from it? Thank you. So anyone?
I can start because I have known contributions, but no, in general, I think that the most important things that we do is that I did or that I have been had to do to see with this or to deal with is the conference that we organized in 2013 on the Crossroads, and I think that was the last biggest gathering of LGBT scholars from. There were people from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Armenia, from Central Asia. It is incredible to imagine anything like that now. It wouldn't be really possible, I guess, for so many reasons. And it was not that long ago. And I was just looking at this book recently, and I suddenly realized that unfortunately most of people left Unfortunately, most of them are now in exile or are now struggling to survive somewhere else. Their careers have been, very often destroyed, and they had to start from zero, and not all of them have an opportunity to learn languages. As your dentist friend in Berlin, Marina, they really need to kind of start from zero, and it is something that maybe not directly answering your question, Sasha, but it is something that very often I think that I'm proud we did that, back in time, and I'm glad we were able to manage, even though the law was already approved that there is an 18 plus at the cover of the book. But yes, maybe this is the main thing I did, I think. Yes.
And you can find this book online, I believe, right?
You can, yes, you can.
We could jump on what Evgeny was saying, is that, of course, as a socially engaged scholar, as many of us, what I find often very frustrating is how our research, how difficult it is to translate our research into policies. So what I've been doing for the last 2 years, and what many colleagues of mine, feminist scholars, have been doing, was also trying to communicate the research results to policymakers, to institutions like UN Women, like World Bank, like Freedom House, USAID, and so on. Unfortunately, so and this is one thing, one contribution which I think is important on the one hand. On the other, I don't have any illusions, because then next thing you struggle with, okay, you deliver this policy recommendations or suggestions, and then you see how they would tell you, oh, okay, yeah, it's all nice, but we'd rather have another visibility campaign or another advocacy kind of advocacy thing or reception, or we will put Ukrainian flag somewhere, rather than do what is requested. For example, give core funding, institutional funding to secure salaries for LGBTQ activists who work 24/7 distributing humanitarian assistance. And another thing, the contribution or a takeaway for broader audience, or for those who are here today, would be, of course, for me to let people hear voices of my interviewees, my colleagues, friends, and to give their perspective, because we know it is sometimes one-dimensional, as Evgeny was saying. A gay refugee is the one who likes Madonna and follows Eurovision, and not someone who, I don't know, who works as electricist and cares about heavy metal maybe and follows football matches. So I think by ethnographic writing, by giving quotations of interview and telling real stories, we also allow people to create much more multifaceted image of who queer migrants from our countries and from other countries are, and to help establish a dialogue and maybe better absorption of these people by host societies.
Thank you so much, Marina.
I can jump in next. I'm thinking about how researching narratives of queer immigration in Russia and in Central Asia really helps to elucidate and crystallize the workings of colonial past, but also present, the coloniality present today, of gender and sexuality in the region, but also outside of the region. I'm also thinking about questioning and expanding some of the traditional hegemonies in migration studies that often ignore non-cis, non-white experiences, and as well as directions of migrations that are, again, sort of questioning and in terms of trajectory of moving from northwest towards southeast is a very interesting direction, and something that is not often researched in migration studies. And our findings from both participants in Kazakhstan and in other Central Asian countries, again, it's important not to homogenize those. They're very diverse in terms of queer politics experiences, but they both show how people in some ways reproduce those narratives, but also challenge them. They show cracks in some of those discourses and show the ways to actually, in which people find ways of being and grapple with those questions. So for a lot of Russian queer migrants, that's very much the case, how people are thinking about their privilege, about their imperialism, and actively trying to find a way to be in local communities and do something differently.
Thank you, Mari.
And I can just wrap us up then, Alex, thanks. You know, kind of coming back to how these experiences are depicted, right? My other panelists here have very, I guess, practical research insofar as, you know, highlighting these experiences and how we move that into action or policy. And of course, I presented on how these experiences are represented, which also has its impact on public opinion and policy, perhaps in a different way. And so I'll try to answer the questions that you've given us, Alex, in a concise way here altogether. But I think the important contribution here is highlighting maybe the things that we miss in these representations, right? Whether it be the kind of intentional depiction of victim narratives in a homo-nationalist kind of presentation, or in one that is necessary for asylum seeking, right? Versus who is a victim, who's allowed to be a victim, right? And what these filmic techniques might do as far as racialization, neither positive nor negative, but to the viewer and how it influences that viewer opinion or sentimentality. You know, for example, I think this was a intentional choice, because when it's revealed that this is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Russian, right, the viewer gets excited for a hope of justice, right? As opposed to maybe someone who is ethnically Chechen, who maybe, I don't know, there wouldn't be as much hope for justice in a Russian court of law, or you know, who might elicit more you know, sympathy or feeling of you know, victimhood here, a white blonde-haired Russian, or you know, a you know, Chechen. So, so of course, kind of drawing attention to that, it is my hope that we might better understand the complexities of these experiences and the people who come from the Russian Federation who may not be, you know, Slavic. Yeah, just wrapping up, I think that was my most surprising discovery, is that, you know, how through the literal lens of an American filmmaker who's making a documentary film, which may be assumed to be kind of, you know, close to a news report, right, or reality, how are these intentional manipulations of identities and likenesses, as far as film techniques are concerned, how does that obscure the supposed reality? So, thank you.
Thank you, Randy. We have one more audience question for Maria from Didar Moldajanov. Have you heard of the law that has prohibited queers from taking custody of orphans in Kazakhstan? If yes, do you think there's a tendency to copy Russian policy on queers?
Yeah, I've heard of that law, and there is a lot of interesting debate about how Russian soft power comes in Kazakhstan and legislation. So, for example, 2015 iteration of Russian propaganda laws that was deemed unconstitutional in Kazakhstan, yet this law has been passed, and amendments in constitution that specify that the marriage is between man and a woman, so placing that as a heterosexual monogamous entity in the constitution. However, again, despite those influences, there are different powers at play, and Kazakhstan, I would say, with its policy of Eurasianism and multi-vectorism, things that are really focusing on retaining friendly relationships with major political players in the world, challenges some of that Russian soft power. So Kazakhstan is a lot more abstaining often in voting against anti-LGBT laws. Kazakhstan is often sort of has a much more ambiguous position in relation to its queer citizens. So it's a there is a bit of push and pull and complexity there. And just now I'm aware in activist circles, there is a lot of tension and a lot of pressure and fear with how it feels. People often feel quite encircled with now Kyrgyzstan taking in the law against propaganda of homosexuality in August 2023. So there is something about Kazakhstan becoming quite isolated as well in terms of still retaining its status as relatively gay-friendly, and Almaty being the gay capital of Central Asia. But it has tensions. And again, Kazakhstan is also massively diverse, as Evgeny rightly pointed out, in itself as much as Central Asia. But you have huge differences between different regions and locales there. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Maria. Well, so in lieu of closing remarks, I would like to ask one more question of everyone who feels like answering it. And I just have to ask it because we have been thinking in the area studies of decolonizing it. And so in the context of decolonizing area studies, what do you think studying queer migration specifically can contribute to this process? And what possible new ways of paying attention to migrant and diasporic spaces can add to area studies? Thanks.
Now we'll have to stay for another hour and a half, I guess, no, to answer this. Again, like I just, in one word, I want to say that what we need to, the studying LGBT, and well, actually, no, what I want to say here, and I meant to say before, I think that there is this interesting transformation of queer and LGBT in the politicization when it comes to the context of, let's say, Russian language, because I think that the only part of this diverse experiences in that geographical area we were discussing today that I actually know, you know, and I recognize my limitations despite being from there, let's say. But there is one thing that is very important, that I think what queer had this subversive potential in the English language academy or in the English language thinking is absolutely not the same in Russia, because queer is actually something which is less politicized maybe than the LGBT, and the idea of subversion or the idea of provocation or the idea of, you know, politicization of that is much more linked to the acronym LGBT rather than to the queer, which is becoming like an obscure term which reflects to something that no one really knows what it is. Yeah, so maybe this is something that not in a migration but in a post-colonial thinking is something to reflect on, because I you know, this is something I was thinking about years and years and years, and I never liked the word queer because it never meant anything to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhenya.
Yes, just to add a couple of words on this is that, of course, for many Ukrainian queer active or LGBTQ activists and feminist scholars, what is important not only in studying queer migration but in principle in the length of these last 2 years in particular is to deal with the still dominating epistemic violence and knowledge extraction, which has been taking place for years. And for us, it's a kind of a double struggle, because on the one hand, of course, we are trying to now address the domination of Russian studies in the field and certain perspectives that existed until recently, when the interest in Ukraine emerged simply because now Ukraine is being violently attacked. But on the other hand is, of course, also dealing with this West-splaining and many Western scholars trying to explain events or phenomenon or phenomena or things taking place in Ukraine using their own concepts and sometimes judging very far, from very big distance, making themselves experts on something they never experienced without speaking the language, not even Russian, not to mention Ukrainian, without really knowing the history, but then throwing the concepts like, I don't know, homonationalism or militarization and so on and so that. And the problem is that these people are getting the space and the stage and attention simply because they are well known already in academia. So for us, this decolonizing effort would be the solidarity within the region and trying to subvert that and to address that as much as possible.
Thank you.
Spoke to some of those things already in terms of really showing some of the colonial dynamics in the region. But I'm thinking about, again, challenging the focus on economic and migration studies, the focus on individualistic expansion, which is also quite an imperialist project, and looking at the outside of predominant focus on West. Instead, queer migration to Central Asia, in Central Asia, apart from showing those alternative directions and patterns of migration, disrupt this focus on cis heteronormative and monogamous subjectivities and white subjectivities as well. So thinking about race, again, similarly to what Marina the point that was just made there, thinking about the epistemic injustices and how knowledge is created. So shifting the creation of knowledge to local researchers producing knowledge that is accessible to local communities and local diasporas, and how research on migration can also speak and help to those. And thinking again of evolving and unfolding Russian migration to Central Asia, and how much trans folk are relying on support from local communities, for example, in terms of accessing local healthcare, and how useful is information from local trans folk to new arrivals to Kazakhstan, to Uzbekistan, to other locations.
And I know we're at time here, but I'll just wrap us up. As far as approaches to media that might disrupt notions, specifically Western notions of whiteness, positive whiteness versus negative blackness, and how even well-meaning media might be, these codes might be embedded within the depictions, and in doing so, disrupting notions of West versus East, not necessarily from a Western perspective, but rather from an Eastern perspective, and how West and East is problematized from that perspective in terms of racialization.
Well, thank you everyone again. And yes, we are at time. So thank you again, Chris and Emma and the Davis Center and the ACES and every regional, university research center in area studies that has sponsored and contributed to making this panel possible in the entire series. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, the panelists. You are the best, the most fabulous speakers ever. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you to Maria, Marina, Yevgeny, Randall, and of course, Alexandra for joining us. And thank you to our audience for being with us. As a reminder, we hope that you'll consider attending our upcoming sessions. The next one is not next Friday, but the Friday after. So March 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern time. That conversation will build on today's session by looking at queer studies through the lens of activism. So thank you again, and we hope to see you on the 15th. Have a great day.